So, it is with great pleasure I inaugurate this fall series of graduate fine arts lectures from our eminent series of visiting artists, the first and possibly most eminent of which is Dawoud Bey, our speaker tonight. Dawoud began his career as a photographer in 1975 with a series of photographs, Harlem, USA, that were later exhibited in his first one-person exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1979. For those of you who are students, this was quite a long time before he even went to college or graduate school, so graduate school anyway. He has since had numerous exhibitions worldwide. The Walker Art Center organized a mid-career survey of his work, Dawoud Bey Portraits 1975 to 1995, that traveled all over the United States and Europe. Most recently, in 2012, the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago organized Dawoud Bey Picturing People, a survey exhibition of his work from 1981 to 2012. And a publication of that exhibition is slated for now. Maybe Dawoud will tell us about that. Bey's works are included in the permanent collections of numerous museums here and abroad. He's been honored with numerous fellowships over the course of his long career, including a Guggenheim in 2002 and an NEA in '91. Dawoud is also a writer and curator. His critical texts have appeared in publications throughout Europe and the United States, and he's curated a wide range of exhibitions at museums and institutions. He also writes regularly for his blog, What's Going On. That's www.what'sgoingon, Dawoud Bey's blogspot at blog.blogspot.com. I think if you Google him, you'll find it. Dawoud holds an MFA from Yale University School of Art and is currently professor of art and a distinguished college artist at Columbia College, Chicago, where he has taught since 1998. Please welcome Dawoud Bey.
Thank you, and thank all of you for coming out this evening. I want to thank all of you who were involved in inviting me to be here at CCA, and it's always wonderful to be back in San Francisco among friends. I do want to dedicate my talk this evening to a friend of mine and someone that I know was very close to and a friend of a lot of you at this institution. So I want to dedicate my remarks this evening to my good and late friend, Larry Selton. I wanted to, this evening, looking at those numbers, 1975 to 2011, actually, it's going to be a little longer because now I have some work to show you from 2012. So if you'll bear with me, what I want to do is to give you a sense of where and how my work began and how my thinking about my work, the ideas about my work and the actual work itself has gone forward since then. So my work begins in 1969 when I was 16 years old. And I had just gotten the previous year my first camera, which I had inherited from my godfather, who had passed away the year before. And for no reason that was apparent to me, my godmother decided to give me his camera. And that pretty much got me started. My curiosity about what to do with the camera, coupled a year later with the experience of the Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, began to set the trajectory for what I was going to spend the rest of my life up to this point doing. The Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met was a very, I guess you would say, auspicious introduction for me to both seeing photographs on the wall of a museum, and also because of the circumstances under which I went to the Met in the first place. The Harlem on My Mind exhibition was a very controversial exhibition, and without going into too much of the history, it was controversial because it was an exhibition about an African-American community, Harlem, in which the community itself had not had an active role or voice in the construction of this exhibition that purported to be about them. So that became a flashpoint around the question of who was allowed to publicly author the experience of a particular community. And then along with that, there was an essay that had been published in this book, which was the catalog for the exhibition, that had been written by a young student from City College, New York, that took a very critical look at the relationship between Jewish shopkeepers in Harlem at that time and the larger Harlem community. And the essay, unfortunately, was edited in such a way that there were sources that were being quoted in the essay in a highly inflammatory way, and it ended up appearing as if those remarks were being made by the young student essayist. And so the Jewish community, a segment of the Jewish community, was out protesting the exhibition as well. And so I heard about the various controversies and decided that I wanted to go see the exhibition. And being introduced to the museum at that moment, at a moment when people were speaking back to the institution in 1969 rather, was something that proved to be very significant in terms of my own thinking about the museum as a very active and loaded space. And of course, if you know your history, you know that 1968, 1969, and the early 70s were a particularly significant moment in American history in terms of speaking back to institutions in power of all kinds, not just the museum. So that moment that I was introduced to the museum gave me, from the very beginning, a very different sense of what the museum was and how one might function in relation to the institutional space of the museum. And I'm going to show you later in my presentation a project that I did recently with one particular museum that addresses that particular issue. But from the experience of the exhibition itself, Harlem on My Mind, the work that began to make the strongest impression on me were photographs by James Van der Zee. And Van der Zee was an African-American studio photographer who had a studio in Harlem in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And his work was rediscovered by Reginald McGee, who was an African-American photo researcher who was working with Alan Schoner, who was the curator and organizer of the Harlem on My Mind exhibition. And Van der Zee's photographs for me, along with a number of other photographs in the exhibition, were the first time that I had ever seen photographs of African Americans on the wall in a museum. It was the first time that I had seen people walking around in a museum looking at photographs of African Americans, giving them serious consideration. So those photographs, and given the fact that that was the first time that I had ever gone to a museum on my own, that experience had a profound impact on me. As I was beginning to grapple with the issue of what my own subject matter was going to be, what do I do with this camera that I had? I started going out on my own, just looking at a lot of photographs. And I was fortunate in that my dad, every Sunday, he bought the New York Times. And I'm not exactly sure how or why, but I started looking at the art section, and I noticed the exhibition listings, and all the way back then, at the bottom of the exhibition listing was a very, very short listing of exhibitions under the heading of photography. And there were never more than 2 or 3 exhibitions of photography going on in New York at that time in the early and mid-1970s. So I started looking in the New York Times, and I would see photography exhibition at whatever museum, and then I would go. So I started frequenting museums and galleries, looking at a lot of work, and I began to notice that the work that resonated for me most strongly were the photographs of people, including these photographs by Mike Dishfarmer, who was a studio photographer in Herbert Springs, Arkansas, in the 1940s. Much like Van der Zee in New York in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, was making photographs of people who came to the studio to mark a special occasion or to have a photograph made. And like Van der Zee, those pictures, which were not at all made with the purpose of being shown in a museum or gallery, years later found their way into a museum context. And the Museum of Modern Art showed a very small group of these Dishfarmer portraits around 1976. And I stumbled upon these pictures. I wasn't looking for them. I just went to see photographs in the photography galleries at MoMA. And I saw these Dishfarmer pictures and went back about 2 or 3 times to keep looking at them. And there was something about them that was very compelling to me. Although, if you were to describe them, you'd probably just say that they're people standing looking at the camera. And that pretty much describes them. 2 people, or an individual, standing upright, looking into the camera. But the aspect of both material culture through the clothing, the psychological nuances and differences, and the ways in which the subjects related to each other gesturally and behaviorally, they began to speak to me in a very significant way. The following year, 1977, I went to the Marlborough Gallery, And Marlborough Gallery had just mounted an exhibition of Richard Avedon's portraits. I probably had some idea who he was, although this was the first time I had actually seen the work. So I went to the Marlborough Gallery in New York and spent a considerable amount of time looking at these photographs. And I have to tell you, just to provide some context, it was a pretty intimidating experience for me going to these museums and galleries on my own. I didn't ask anyone on my block to go with me. It didn't occur to me to ask my brother if he wanted to go because he clearly wasn't interested. It was just something that I determined that I needed to do, and it was something I thought I needed to see in order to figure out what I was going to do with this camera, because I was determined to do something. And it was basically my own way of beginning my process of self-education regarding the history of photography prior to actually going to art school. Along with those photographers, I encountered photographs of Roy de Carava, initially in a book called The Sweet Flypaper of Life, which de Carava had published in collaboration with Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes wrote the text, and Roy de Carava had already made the pictures and had tried unsuccessfully to get the pictures published. And Langston Hughes, who was a well-published writer and poet and essayist at that point, told de Carava that if he wrote some text to go with the photograph, maybe together they could get them published, which they did as The Sweet Flypaper of Life. And Roy de Carava became very important to me as the first African-American photographer whose work I encountered, who was not a studio photographer making work on commission for people who came in from the streets to be photographed. He wasn't a photojournalist. He was someone who was making these pictures for entirely self-motivated and aesthetic reasons. Someone who was taking on the challenge of taking the African-American experience as he knew it and wrapping some kind of dynamic form around the subject matter, which made the pictures both a conversation with African-American culture and also a conversation with the history of photography and the use of the photographic medium. His subjectivity and his integrity became very significant to me, along with the works of, among others, Gordon Parks, who was an African-American photographer who worked for Life magazine, among many other things, and the German photographer, August Sander, whose work I encountered. And Sander had undertaken a monumental project to document the German community prior to the Second World War. And Walker Evans, whose work I first encountered in the context of the Farm Security Administration photographs from the 1930s. And all of these photographs, you'll notice, have that same thing in common. It's a person looking at the camera. They're portraits. They're portraits that have varying degrees of psychological resonance, cultural significance, and individual gesturally significant behaviors going on in the photograph. So with these photographs, along with having looked at works by artists like Charles White, who made iconic images of African Americans. Charles Wright worked both in Chicago and in his later years was a professor here on the West Coast at Otis. And Romeo Bearden, who was another African American artist, who made work about ordinary African Americans, both those in Mecklenburg, where he was from, as well as Harlem, New York. And I had been paying attention also to the work of Emory Douglas. And Emory's work appeared as posters and as graphic and illustrations in the Black Panther Party newspaper beginning in the late 60s. So all of this work that I had looked at, including these and others, began to shape my sense of what my own subject matter was going to be. And in 1975, I began photographing in Harlem, New York. I'm not from Harlem, but my mother and father had lived in Harlem for a number of years. And in fact, only left Harlem when I was born to move out to the suburbs of Queens. But out of the experience initially of the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, along with my family's personal history of having lived in Harlem, I decided that that was going to be the subject matter that I was going to begin to wrap my thinking around as far as making photographs. So in 1975, I began taking first the bus and then the train into Harlem from Queens, New York, where I was living, and began trying to figure out how to make the experience of this African American community into interesting photographs. And this particular picture of the man wearing the bowler became the first photograph in which I thought that I was beginning to realize the ambitions that I had set for myself. You know, because it's one thing to want to make the photographs, it's another thing to have decided what your subject matter was going to be. But neither one of those things necessarily translates into an interesting photograph for all of the reasons that, you know, two-dimensional art objects work in terms of the relationship of the subject to the frame, in terms of, in this case, a credible psychological and physical description of the person in front of the camera. And I started out photographing in Harlem before I went, wanting to make pictures that I thought would create an honest image of this community. Initially, I think I wanted to create a positive image of the community. But as I began photographing, I realized that this kind of binary notion of making a positive image gave way to just trying to honestly describe the lives of the people living in that community. So this is the first picture in which I believe that I was actually doing the thing I had up to that point only imagining myself doing. And it was a very difficult picture for me. The first time I saw this, I passed this man on a Sunday morning, and he was actually standing talking to about 3 of his friends. And I saw him, and I knew I wanted to photograph him. But I initially lost my nerve and just walked right past him. I saw him, I looked at him, but I didn't know at that point how to insert myself into the social situation in order to make the photograph. Because while I may have been African American, much like the people in the community, I was still an outsider in that community. I was a photographer who didn't live there, attempting to represent that community. And I knew that I first had to establish for myself a degree of familiarity with the community, as well as to spend enough time walking around in the neighborhood so that people began to become familiar with me. And this picture is the first time that I was actually able to break through my reticence, my nervousness, and approach someone and ask them if I could make a photograph of them. And it's the first time that the resulting photograph that you see was successful by the terms that I had set for myself based on all of that work that I had looked at previously. And I show you this one as the second photograph because along with the first one, which was the first time that I figured out how to break through that wall that I thought existed between me and the subject because of the introduction of the camera into the situation. This is a photograph where for the first time I actually began to direct the subject in front of the camera, which is something that at that point I thought you weren't supposed to do because that compromised the authenticity of the photograph. And this is actually this young woman. I actually saw her from across the street, and I knew I wanted to make a photograph of her. But I knew that once I crossed the street and asked her if I could make a picture of her, everything was going to change, gesture, psychology, behavior. And I've never worked with a long lens. All of these pictures, which are made with a 35mm camera and a slightly wide 35mm lens, demand that you get pretty close to the subjects and have a real physical interaction with them. So I crossed the street and asked her if I could make a picture of her. And of course, as soon as I walked up to her, she put her arms down and everything changed. And I asked her if I could make a photograph of her, and she said, sure, what do you want me to do? And at that point, I had a kind of light bulb moment because I realized what I wanted her to do was actually what she had been doing before I approached her. And so it occurred to me, and I said, well, why don't you do what you were doing before I walked up to you? Which at that early stage was a huge conceptual leap for me to actually direct the behavior of the person in front of the camera. And when I told her that, she just went back to doing exactly what she had been doing before I walked up to her. And that was the first time that I began to really more fully realize, that there's the life of the subject in the photograph, and then there's the life of the subject in the real world. And they're somehow related, but they're not the same thing. And from that point on, what I became most interested in was the way of describing the subject through the photograph, not worrying about whether I had directed them or not, but becoming more concerned with how they appeared and how they were represented in the pictures. So I continued that project from 1975 to 1978. And in 1979, I approached the Studio Museum in Harlem, where I'd actually started teaching photography classes back in 1976 or 77. And I approached them with the photographs that I had made up to that point to ask them about doing an exhibition. And that exhibition opened November of 1979. And so after 4 or 5 years of photographing in Harlem with the 35, the small handheld 35 millimeter camera, I decided to rethink the way in which I was making photographs, to rethink the way I was making photographs, both in terms of how I was making them materially, as well as the kinds of relationships I was having with the people that I was photographing, the quality of description in the photographs that I was making of people, and also some of the conceptual issues and concerns that I was beginning to have about the ways in which I was making photographs. So in 1988, I began photographing with a 4x5 camera mounted on a tripod, which was designed to, among other things, slow down the way in which I was making the photograph, and also because of the change to large format, change the quality, the material quality of description of the pictures in a fundamentally different way materially, and also allowed for more sustained contact between me and the people that I was photographing. And at that point, all of the photographs that I began making, because of the nature of working with a large camera on a tripod, which is not designed to make spontaneous photographs, whether of human subjects or otherwise, but to actually set things up in a very intentional way. So I began photographing in the neighborhood that I was living in at that time in Brooklyn, continuing to photograph African American subjects, but wanting to give them an even more heightened sense of physical presence in the work, as well as wanting to more directly engage with the issue of the gaze in relation to the subject and the viewer. So in all of these photographs, no one in the photograph is doing what they were doing before I encountered them and we went about setting up the situation for making the pictures. And while they're staged, I didn't want my hand to be too heavily present in the photographs. I did want them to have the informality of a casual encounter, or the informality of everyday experience that would allow us to believe that the photograph and the thing that you see in the photograph is something that is true to the individual. And in fact, all of the gestural things that are going on in these photographs are things that I pretty much worked with the people that I was photographing to enact within the frame of the space of the picture. So I would basically walk around with this 4x5 camera, tripod, and type 55 Polaroid material. And the type 55 Polaroid film, which unfortunately no longer exists, allowed for the making of an instant 4x5 print, which I would then give to the person that I was photographing, as well as allowing for the making of an instant, very good quality 4x5 negative, from which I would later make exhibition prints. At the time I first started printing these in the 80s, because I wanted them to be, I wanted them to have a sense of physical presence. Initially I printed these 20 by 24, which for me was a huge leap in scale at that time, because the photographs, the first group of pictures that I showed you in Harlem, those were printed 6x9. They were very intimate, small photographs. So I've gone from a very small object to 20x24, and now I'm printing all of these as 32x40 pigment prints, and I'm feeling like I'm fully realizing these works for the first time, because that's the kind of physical presence that I always wanted these pictures to have. And you know, these photographs are about, in addition to the notion of the gaze, it's this enhanced physical presence of the subjects in the space that they're in, their momentary ownership of the space and their momentary collaborative working to shape a representation of themselves. And they're all completely, there's nothing spontaneous about them. I saw this couple walking towards me in the park. I thought I might want to make a photograph of them. I asked them, they said yes, and then we began to put the pose and the picture together. And always, you know, when I ask people to pose for me, I always allow them to make the first gesture. I just say, make yourself comfortable. And then whatever they do, that's the beginning of shaping the gesture into something that I think invokes a compelling sense of presence. I love that hat. I just love that hat. And those glasses. So these pictures initially were made in Brooklyn, New York, and then I went on to continue this work, working in one particular community in Washington, D.C., and also in Rochester, New York. One of the things I should mention, too, is that in each city where these photographs are made, initially the photographs that I made in Brooklyn were first shown in a nonprofit space in Brooklyn called the Barbican Centre for the Arts. So the photographs that I made in Brooklyn, initially I wanted the community in which the work had been made to have access to the photographs. It was very important to me that the work initially be made available in the same space in which the same neighborhoods in which the photographs had been made. And that went all the way back to, you know, the whole issue of Harlem on my mind, photographs in Harlem and being shown downtown, which is why it was very important to me when I finished the Harlem, USA photograph, that the first place they be shown was at Studio Museum in Harlem. Because I always want to make the work that I do in those communities initially available to the communities in which the work is made. So these works were first shown in Brooklyn, New York, and then in an exhibition at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, where I spent a month making the work. This whole question of the ways in which we can think about and in some ways conflate the notion of subject and audience. The fact that the subject of the work can also be a part of the construct of the audience of the work is something that I've been thinking about since the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, in which the subject of the work was decidedly not the audience for the work. After working with the black and white Type 55 Polaroid film from 1988 to 1991, by that time I had been making all of my work in the environment of the street, going back to 1975. And I wanted to find a different space and a different way to think about the making of my work. The work that I had been doing with the Type 55 film, that film had been supplied to me by Polaroid as part of the Polaroid Artist Support Program. And the way that worked was basically they would send me the black and white Type 55 film, and I would send them images for their collection. And in return for the images, they would send me more film. And that went on for several years, and that's how I was able to make that work. And that's also what established my relationship with Polaroid. I had been aware of the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera for some time, and in 1991, Polaroid approached me and asked me if I would be interested in making work with the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera. This is just a location photograph to give you a sense, if you haven't seen it, of what that camera looks like. This is from when I set it up in a studio in the National Portrait Gallery in London in 1997. But it's basically, it's still being used. Initially there were 4 of them made by Polaroid in the 1970s. And they were used initially to do high-end copy work of paintings and other art objects from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And then later they started making them available to both artists and commercial photographers to do their work. Artists were asked to use the work as part, again, of Polaroid's Artist Support Program, in which they would give you a day in the studio in return for 2 photographs from that day's work. So in 1991, I began working in the Polaroid studio in New York, making photographs initially of artist friends of mine who I asked to come and sit for formal portraits. And those pictures were very much inspired by an early experience that I had when I was asked in the 6th grade to write a report on Rembrandt. And in the 6th grade, I fell in love with Rembrandt's paintings. And all the years that I was working in black and white in the street, working with the net photography, tradition of street photography, I wasn't able to make any kind of direct use of that influence. But when I started photographing in the 20 by 24 studio, I decided to start working in color. There was a black and white Polaroid 20 by 24 Polaroid material as well. But I wanted to begin to find other ways to continue my interest in making portraits and eliminating for the moment the narrative of social context that had informed so much of the work that I had done up to that point, wherein the environment that the subject is in is very much a part of the narrative of the subject. I wanted to see what would happen if I removed the subject from a particular kind of social space and moved to the environment of the studio where the attention is focused more resolutely on the individual. So I started asking artist friends of mine to come to the studio to sit for these portraits that you see here. And initially, these were individual images, and as I was pinning these photographs up and looking at them, I began to notice that I actually liked the way the photographs looked together more than I did the way they looked separately. And I began to make the double portraits, these diptych portraits, that begin to open up the idea about photographic representation as a single moment, and began to open up the idea of time in the photograph, constructing photographs from multiple moments, and creating a shift from one image to the other that implied the passing of time. And this is also, this piece from 1992 is also the first time that I was asked to do an extended residency project. In this case, at Phillips Andover, which is a prep school in Massachusetts, and it's the site of the Addison Gallery of American Art, which has had an artist-in-residence program for a very, very long time. Charles Sheeler was actually the first artist-in-residence there. I forget what year, either 1935 or 41. I know those are very different years, but Charles Sheeler was the first artist-in-residence at the Addison Gallery of American Art, and they have had artist-in-residence there continually ever since. And I've actually been back as artist-in-residence at the Addison Gallery over the years. I've been there on 5 different occasions, making very different works and projects each time. But this was the first time I was asked to be there, and it's the first time that I began to think about my subject matter in a very different way. I was surrounded by young people, high school age students, and I began to think about the ways in which young people have traditionally been represented within visual culture. And I began to make these photographs with students from both Phillips Andover, as well as students from Lawrence High, which is a neighboring town, about 15 minutes away from Andover, in what was then an economically very depressed, economically depressed town. And I began to devise a series of activities around my picture making that allowed both for a conversation between students at Phillips Andover and Phillips at Lawrence High by bringing them to the studio together, and then devising programs that created a conversation between the institutions. And it's the first time that I began to think about how my work as an artist could be used as a catalyst to create different kinds of reordering of institutional space as an artist that extended from art making out into the larger social world, as well as a place where I could continue to push my ideas about art making and about photography and what it meant to make photo-based work, what it meant to bring this kind of monumentalized presence to the young subject, what it meant to represent young people in a psychologically and physically compelling way that is quite different from how they have traditionally been represented within the social culture. So this work is about a set of multiple agendas that I began to enact with my work, both around art making and around institutional engagement, and getting young people into the equation of both art making and giving them some access to the institutional space through my work as an artist. What I did when I was making this work was to set up a semi-public studio in the institutional space. So at the Addison Gallery, I set up a studio in a temporarily empty gallery in the museum, and had students come to the museum, not to, as we traditionally think about going to a museum to see work already made, but to see work being made in a museum that would later hang in that museum, to kind of open up and flipped this notion of the museum as a place where art is shown and turned it into a space where art was being made. So I did these residency projects working with young people in different institutional collaborations, beginning in '92 with the Addison Gallery in Phillips, and then working in Hartford, Connecticut at the Wadsworth Atheneum, National Portrait Gallery in London, Contemporary Art Museum in Cleveland, a wide range of institutions. And in each case, making those institutions both available to young people and then developing larger projects in which they were making their own work as well within the construct of this larger project that I was doing. So from 1991 to about 1998, I worked exclusively with the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera, making first these single images, and as you see, these larger images. To get a sense of scale, each of these is 22 by 30. So this would be 66 by 60. Just to give you a sense of, yeah, it's probably almost as large as what you see on that screen there, now that I look at that. So as I kept working with the camera and doing these projects, I'm also, in the context of the project, trying to reinvent my own ideas about picture making. You know, some of them went from the individual pictures, diptychs, overall photographs that describe a single moment, and then in these, a sense of moving around the subject. And then in something like this, a more abbreviated description of the subject, even as they're a lot more closer to the subject in terms of physical proximity. There's a degree of heightened physical and optical description that's pretty difficult to see in this kind of third generation projection. But these pieces are also about, you know, this notion of making something that is much more highly descriptive even than what we can see with the naked eye, using the camera to create a level of physical description that is pretty much hyper-real and monumental at the same time, and to take that idea and have that rest on the young subject. In 2001, after working with the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera from 1991 to 1998, I returned to, again, working in the natural environment, going back to the 4x5 camera, but this time bringing forward the use of color material that I had first started using when I started working with the 20 by 24 Polaroid. And I did this very small group of works, photographing young people in a park in Chicago, where I was living at that time and where I still live now. This work was a way for me, after all those years of working with the Polaroid camera, which was becoming increasingly more logistically complicated. I wanted to return to making photographs in a more fundamental way again. I wanted to be back out in the world after all those years of making work in the space of the studio. So I started making these color street portraits in 2001. And these are quite large also. They're 50 by 40. So I'm still very much interested in this kind of heightened, monumentalized representation of ordinary people. And then in 2002, I began a project, another residency project initially, class pictures, that I started in Chicago. And it started initially as a residency project that I did with the Smart Museum of Art in Chicago, working there for 8 weeks and bringing together young people from 3 very different educational cultures in Chicago. One of them being the lab school, University of Chicago Laboratory School. The other being Kenwood Academy, which is a magnet school, and the other was South Shore High, which is a very troubled public high school. Bringing these students together, I think once or twice a week. I forget exactly how we structured it over 8 weeks, to engage in a range of activity in the museum, to look critically at the ways in which young people are represented in popular culture. I had them curating an exhibition of portrait works from the museum's collection. And during the week, I was going to their school, making photographs of them in the school. And one of the things that I began to do in this work was to try to address the question of information that is left out of the photograph. Because photographs, when you think about them, they probably leave out a lot more information than they contain, considering how we put a frame around the subject. And there's the whole world outside of the frame. So I wanted to begin to address that by bringing the actual voice of the subjects into the construct of the work. So here you can see, this is one of the times that I returned to Phillips Andover. I went back to work on the class pictures project there. I started by photographing in the 3 schools in Chicago, and then Detroit, a public high school in Detroit, Chadsey High, and that was through a residency project with the Detroit Institute of Arts. From there, I went down to Orlando, Florida, through the Zora Neale Hurston Museum in Eatonville, and photographed students in Orlando. Then I came here and photographed students in 2 high schools here, School of the Arts in Diamond Heights. And what was the other school, Trish? Yeah. There's 2 schools here, and then about 10 different high schools in New York through a program at Studio Museum in Harlem called Expanding the Walls. And in each one of them, as I was here, I was in the school, both making photographs, and as you see in the photograph on the right, you know, going into the classrooms, talking to students about my work, and looking at the work that students were doing as well. And initially, when I started this work, I had the students, I recorded audio audio files of them talking about themselves. And as I went forward, I began to ask them to write something about themselves. And that text and the photographs were shown together. So the way I made this work, I would be in the school for anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, sometimes a month, photographing. And I would have one student come to a temporarily empty classroom. I had a sheet of paper with one question, and that question was usually something along the lines of, tell me something about yourself that you would like people to know, that you think they don't know about you, that describes who you really are. Or tell me something that you would like people to know. It was a variation on tell me something about yourself that you think describes you, that people might not know about you. And then I just allowed them to sit for as long as they needed to sit to think about the question, to write something. And then when they were finished writing, whatever they wrote, I would just put that aside and we'd sit down and make a photograph. I never read what they wrote before making the pictures because I didn't want to try to make a picture in response to what they may have written, which I think would have been a difficult task at any rate. And I wasn't looking to make a photograph that illustrated what they wrote as much as I was looking to make a compelling representation of them, which when put together with what they wrote would add up to something even more compelling and dimensional than the text alone or the photograph alone. So this is one of the ones from Chicago, from University of Chicago Lab School. And this is another from Chicago. This is from Detroit. This is from Massachusetts, from Lawrence, Massachusetts. And this is from Andover. You know, the degree of profound self-reflection in these texts that these young people wrote about themselves, I think is just absolutely astounding, because these texts are not edited. They are pretty much exactly what they wrote. And this is about as poetic as it gets. And this one is here in San Francisco. And this is, he's a student at Phillips Andover. Now, I have to tell you a brief story about Kevin, because you will see him in a more recent photograph that I made, because it turns out I did a project recently at Emory University. And I showed up at Emory, got an email. He heard I was coming, and he got in touch with me. He has since graduated from Emory. He recently completed a Fulbright in Morocco, where he was doing research on linguistic code switching in French and Arabic, and did his thesis on code switching and linguistics, looking at the work of Andre Gide and James Brown through the lens of their gay male identity. This kid is just, he's extraordinary. He's absolutely extraordinary. You know, and people look at him and they could have one idea about who he is just from his physical appearance and what people think that he must be based on that. But as you can see, I mean, he comes from a very hard scrabble situation in Detroit. And you'll see another recent piece that I did with him in this character project. And actually not this one, but the next one. This character project is a project I did in Chicago in 2007 that was commissioned by, what's that network? I can't even remember now. What's that television network where the hook is all about character? I don't watch enough TV to know. But it's a commissioned project, and they commissioned several photographers to make photographs in different parts of the country, and I agreed to do it if I could photograph young people in Chicago. So what I did was to set up a kind of makeshift studio in the street using the side of a construction shed on Michigan Avenue. And basically sat up there every day from about 10 to 5 for a month, using that location as my kind of outdoor studio. Asking different young people as they were walking by if they would step into my studio for a minute to be photographed. And they're mostly students from Columbia College and Roosevelt University and DePaul colleges in the neighborhood. And what I wanted to do was make a kind of a representation of American young people through this group of young people in Chicago. And I also wanted to, without literally going back into the physical studio, again, move away from the physical space of the classroom, for example, in class pictures, towards a kind of neutral space that once again foregrounded the psychological and gestural behavior of the individual. I just want to briefly show you one project from the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore that I did about 2 years ago, to give you a sense of the other work that I do and how the work that I do as far as making photographs become the catalyst for larger institutional projects. So I was invited to do a residency project at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, which is a historical art museum. Up until recently, only showing works by non-living artists, and they recently began a contemporary program. So I spent an initial week in their library going through cards from their file cards. Their collection isn't on a database, it's still file cards and file cabinets, making a selection of some 300 portrait objects that the students could work with. And the project that I devised was a way of getting students, these young people from Baltimore, how do you get them engaged with a historical museum? So I wanted to create a conversation between the contemporary and the historical, and to give them a sense that those things and those ideas that are present in historical works are also present in some ways in my own contemporary portraits, and to work with them towards shaping an exhibition that created a conversation between my work and these historical objects. So these were 16 young people from a range, again, of very different educational cultures in Baltimore, everything from homeschool, private schools, public schools, and were brought together every day during the summer for a month to engage with the space of the museum, ultimately working towards an exhibition. So we made binders containing all of the works from the collection that I had selected for them to look at as reference material, and also in those binders was a selection of my work from 1975 up until that moment, 2009. And asked them to begin looking at the work with an eye towards selecting works that would create a conversation. They were divided into curatorial teams of 4, and they first had to agree within the group which photographs they wanted to use, and then each group had to present to the larger group as they began the editing process of thinking about which works to include, which works to eliminate. So it was really about getting them to work with each other, using the context of art to give young people a framework of how to talk and work together across lines of presumed difference of race, class, and gender. Once they made the initial selection, they started going into the collection vault to look at the actual objects to begin making final selections for the exhibition based on the actual objects. And trust me, there was a lot of work involved in getting the museum to agree to let this group of 16 teenagers into the collection vault. One of the curators, who actually no longer works there, she told me, Dawoud, I don't even get to go into the collection vault whenever I want. I mean, what can I say? So I'm doing a project, you know. And this kind of project obviously only works if the director of the museum is fully behind this kind of work. And the director at the vault is Gary Vacon. A wonderful man. He was completely behind figuring out ways to work with me to make this museum a more accessible place for the larger community, and in this case, for young people. So they start looking at the actual objects, comparing the objects with the reproductions, trying to figure out what the groupings and pairs are going to be. And you can see here the kinds of relationship that they were looking at. That's a photograph of mine in reproduction on the right that I made actually here in California, in Watsonville, a project that I did in Watsonville. And they're looking at the relationship between these 2 young women. Both of them they're wrapping themselves, one in a shawl, one in a baby's blanket. And they're looking at the gesture, and they're looking at both the similarities and the differences. Along with the curatorial piece of the project, I also structured it so half the day was curatorial work, the other half of the day was what you might call museum studies. And they were meeting with someone in every single department of the museum each day to go behind the white walls of the museum to get a sense of how the museum works. And here you see them in the conservation lab, meeting with one of the conservators who was there from Columbia working on this conservation project with this religious painting in the foreground. And here they're meeting with the museum's lighting designer, talking to the students about lighting objects. And then we had the exhibition designer build a scale model of the space that the exhibition was going to be in, and they began the collaborative process of beginning to place the works. And the last one there is the final placement. Then the exhibition designer comes, and she's looking at the placement, and they took the model into the space to begin to talk about how the model is going to translate into the actual installation. And it was quite complicated because they chose a number of work that had never been exhibited before, some of which required conservation, some of which required the design of special cases to display them. And the director was fine with all of that. And here's the completed exhibition installed in the space. And they also, the wall text, they researched different writings about the portrait, selected the wall text, which you see, this one by Carl Jones. And they recorded, they wrote the script for and recorded the acoustic guide tours for the exhibition. And then some of them went through 2 weeks of trainings to be docents who actually walked museum visitors through their exhibition. And it was interesting because when it went from the model to the actual exhibition, when we first walked into the exhibition space, initially they didn't even recognize that it was their exhibition. You know, they were so blown away because it wasn't in a special education gallery or something in the basement. I mean, it was in the special exhibition room of the museum. And when they first walked in, it took them a moment to realize, oh my God, this is our show. It was amazing. To me, one of the best projects of this kind that I've done in terms of really creating the level of engagement that I wanted to create with the museum, working through things with the museum's head of security, allowing them to have cards to swipe themselves in and out of different parts of the museum. And they've continued this program since my project as well, which is always something that I encourage and hope that the museum will do, to continue this project even after I'm no longer there. And finally, this is a project that I'm in the midst of right now, that I began working on in Atlanta in 2010 at Emory University. And the idea for the project has to do with visualizing this complex notion of community by having two people from a particular community who don't know each other to come together within a particular space within that community, to sit together for their mutual presentation, but first of all to each other, and ultimately their self-presentation to the camera, as a way of visualizing the very dynamic and complex thing that is community, which we tend to think about community sometimes, I think, in an overly simplistic way. And I wanted to try to find a way to take the narrative of the space within a community, in this case, a college campus, and the narrative of that space, and have two people come together to meet each other and then to sit for their mutual representation and their mutual witnessing by the camera as members of that community. So I started working on this project in Emory. I made some more work for this project in Gainesville, Florida, and more recently in Chicago. And here you see, this is Kevin Hatcher from Class Pictures in this Emory photograph. And this is a project that I'm looking to continue. At the moment, I've kind of let it go for a moment for another project that I'm in the midst of doing and working on in Birmingham, Alabama. It's a very different project, but at some point I intend to go back and continue working on this project as well. And here you can see the setup. It's the basic setup that I've used for all of the work that I've done for the last few years. A single strobe, an umbrella, 4x5 camera. Thank you.